The iron hissed against the silk like a warning Margaret Harrison should have heeded years ago. Steam rose from the designer dress sprawled across her marble countertop, filling the kitchen of their suburban mansion with the acrid smell of burning fabric and 28 years of marriage reduced to ash. The iron scorched right through the silk, Margaret whispered into her phone, her voice shaking as she stared at the ruined garment. I can still smell it burning. Her sister Sarah's voice crackled through the speaker with familiar protective fury. Tell me you didn't actually do what he asked. Margaret Harrison, 53 years old and mother of twins, stood in her pristine kitchen surrounded by every luxury money could buy. Imported Italian marble countertops gleamed under crystal chandeliers. The rain drummed against floor-to-ceiling windows, while expensive appliances hummed their expensive songs. Yet she felt poorer than she had at 25, when she'd first met Richard Harrison at a fashion industry mixer. He just walked in here and dropped it on the counter, Margaret said, touching the torn silk. Said Jessica needed it pressed for tonight's investor dinner. Said I know how particular she is about these things. The same dress Richard's pregnant mistress had worn to the company Christmas party 3 months ago. The same party where Margaret had smiled for photographers, played the dutiful CEO wife, and served champagne to investors while her world crumbled around her designer heels. She remembered Jessica's hand resting possessively on her barely showing stomach. Remembered Richard's careful distance from both women. Remembered the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Margaret, Sarah's voice carried that tone their mother used when one of them tracked mud through the house. You've been married to a millionaire ex-husband material for decades. Don't tell me you're just now seeing the signs, Margaret laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. Signs, Sarah. I was holding the smoking gun and calling it a flag. The kitchen door swung open with Richard's particular brand of commanding entrance. At 58, Richard Harrison still cut an impressive figure in his tailored suits, his silver hair perfectly styled, his presence filling rooms like expensive cologne. He'd built Harrison Fashion Group from a small textile company into a multi-million-dollar empire, and he carried that success like armor. Margaret, sweetheart. The endearment dripped with condescension. What's that smell? She held up the ruined dress, silk hanging in charred ribbons. Your girlfriend's wardrobe having a small accident? Richard's jaw tightened, the only tell in his otherwise perfect composure. Jessica isn't my girlfriend. We've discussed this. She's a valued employee who's been helping with the international expansion. Is that what we're calling narcissistic abuse these days? Margaret set the iron down with deliberate care. International expansion. You're being dramatic. Richard moved to the coffee machine, his morning routine unchanged despite the domestic destruction around him. Jessica needed that dress for tonight. The investors expect a certain level of presentation. Margaret watched her husband of 28 years brew his coffee as if silk hadn't just been cremated in their kitchen, as if his pregnant employee wasn't depending on his wife for wardrobe maintenance, as if this was normal behavior for a CEO and his family. Of course, Margaret heard herself say, the automatic response that had smoothed over 2.5 decades of small humiliations. Of course she did. Don't use that tone with me. Richard's voice carried the authority that made board members flinch. You know how important tonight is. The Jakarta deal alone could net us $15 million in the first quarter. Margaret stared at her husband, really looked at him for perhaps the first time in years. The way he stood with his back to her, while speaking, as if her presence was background noise. The way he assumed her compliance, her availability, her willingness to iron another woman's clothes. The way he spoke about us and we when discussing business profits she'd never see a penny of without his permission. Richard, she waited until he turned around. Who is the father of Jessica's baby? For one perfect moment, Richard Harrison, CEO, millionaire, master manipulator, looked like a man caught with his hand in the till. His coffee mug paused halfway to his lips. His eyes went wide, then narrow, then calculating. I have no idea what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm asking a direct question. Margaret moved closer, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. Jessica Powell, 29 years old, 6 months pregnant, wearing designer dresses to company events. Who got her pregnant? Richard set down his coffee with the careful precision of a man buying time. Margaret, I think you need to step back and consider what you're suggesting. Jessica's personal life is none of our business. Our business, Margaret laughed again, the sound sharper this time. Since when is Jessica Powell our business? Since when do we care about her dress code? Since when do I take laundry requests from your employees? Since she became essential to the international expansion? Richard's voice rose slightly, his first crack in the perfect facade. Since she started bringing in the kind of contracts that pay for this house, these clothes, this lifestyle you've gotten so comfortable with. There it was, the threat wrapped in silk, just like Jessica's dress. The reminder that Margaret Harrison existed at her husband's pleasure, lived on his charity, breathed by his permission. 28 years of marriage reduced to a financial transaction with terms she'd never negotiated. Margaret walked to the kitchen island where her phone still lay open, Sarah's voice a tiny lifeline in the marble wilderness. Sarah, I need to call you back. Maggie, don't you dare hang up on me. What's happening? I'm having what you might call a midlife transformation. Margaret looked directly at Richard as she spoke. I'm discovering that some marriages are just long-term narcissistic abuse with better catering. She ended the call before Sarah could respond. The kitchen fell silent except for the rain against the windows and the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Richard stared at her as if she'd started speaking a foreign language. Margaret, his voice softened, shifted into the tone he used when investors needed coaxing. I think you're overreacting. We've built a good life together, a successful life. Don't let jealousy make you say things you'll regret. Jealousy? Margaret felt something shifting inside her chest, something that had been sleeping for years finally stretching awake. Richard, I'm not jealous of Jessica. I'm embarrassed for her. What's that supposed to mean? It means she thinks she's getting a millionaire husband who'll leave his wife for her. Instead, she's getting a man who makes his current wife iron his mistress's dresses. Margaret moved toward the kitchen door. I almost feel sorry for her. Where are you going? Margaret paused in the doorway, her hand on the frame. Behind her, the kitchen held the ruins of Jessica's dress, the smell of burned silk, the echo of 28 years of course, and sweetheart, and you're being dramatic. Ahead of her lay the rest of the house, the rest of her life, the rest of whatever came after you stopped being the perfect wife. I'm going to call a lawyer, she said. I think it's time I learned about divorce settlements. Richard's coffee mug hit the marble counter with a sound like a starting gun. Margaret, wait. Let's talk about this rationally. But Margaret Harrison was already walking away, her bare feet carrying her toward whatever came next. Behind her, she could hear Richard calling her name, his voice losing its commanding edge and taking on something that almost sounded like panic. In the kitchen, Jessica's ruined dress lay cooling on the counter, silk threads scattered like the remnants of a marriage that had been unraveling for longer than anyone wanted to admit. 3 weeks after the dress incident, the silence in the Harrison bedroom felt heavier than words. Margaret lay on her side of their king-size bed, staring at the ceiling while Richard's breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep beside her. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its sound echoing through a house that suddenly felt too large and too empty. She called the lawyer, Linda Cooper, recommended by Sarah's friend, whose own divorce had made headlines in the society pages. Linda had listened to Margaret's story with the clinical attention of a surgeon examining a particularly complex case. Mrs. Harrison, Linda had said in her crisp, no-nonsense voice, let me be absolutely clear about your rights here. In a marriage of 28 years, where you've been effectively excluded from business decisions despite being legally entitled to half of everything, you have significant leverage, but we need documentation, evidence. Proof that Richard Harrison had been systematically hiding assets from his wife while building a separate life with his pregnant employee. Margaret had never thought of her marriage in terms of evidence, but lying in the dark beside her husband, she realized that was exactly what she needed. Richard's phone buzzed on his nightstand. Once, twice, then again. Margaret held her breath, waiting to see if he would answer. The buzzing stopped, then started again immediately. Harrison here, Richard whispered, his voice thick with manufactured sleep. Margaret closed her eyes and listened. No, she's asleep. Richard's voice was barely audible. I told you not to call this late. A pause. Margaret could hear the faint sound of a woman's voice through the phone, urgent and demanding. Of course I care about the baby, Richard said, sitting up slightly. But we have to be careful about timing. The Jakarta deal closes next week, and Margaret's been asking questions. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. Jessica was calling at midnight about their baby. Their baby. While Margaret lay 3 feet away pretending to sleep in her own bed. I know you're uncomfortable, Richard continued, but we agreed to wait until after the IPO announcement. Once the company goes public, I'll have more flexibility with the asset distribution. Asset distribution. Margaret bit her lip to keep from gasping. Richard wasn't just having an affair with Jessica. He was planning their financial future while his wife lay unconscious beside him. Listen to me. Richard's voice hardened. Margaret doesn't understand business. She's been out of the workforce for over 20 years. She has no idea about the real value of the company or how to protect it. By the time she figures out what's happening, everything will be properly secured. The call ended with Richard's whispered, "I love you too." He set the phone back on the nightstand and settled into his pillow, his breathing already returning to the steady rhythm of sleep. Margaret lay perfectly still until she was certain Richard was unconscious, then carefully slipped out of bed. Her feet found her slippers in the dark, and she padded silently to her walk-in closet, closing the door before turning on the light. Surrounded by 28 years of designer clothing, Margaret Harrison sat on her velvet bench and finally let herself cry. Not the careful tears of a woman who'd learned to weep quietly so as not to disturb her husband, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone whose entire life had just revealed itself to be a carefully constructed lie. Her phone lay on the dressing table where she'd left it. Without hesitation, she dialed Sarah's number. Maggie! Sarah's voice was instantly alert despite the late hour. What's wrong? He's planning to hide everything, Margaret whispered. The company, the assets, everything. He thinks I'm too stupid to understand business. What happened? Margaret told her about the midnight phone call. Richard's casual dismissal of her intelligence, his planning around her ignorance. With each detail, Sarah's breathing grew sharper. That narcissistic son of a bitch, Sarah finally said. Maggie, you need to document everything. Every phone call, every conversation, every time he mentions money or business or that pregnant homewrecker. I don't know how to do this. Sarah, I've been out of the workforce for 23 years. What if he's right? What if I am too stupid to understand? Stop? Sarah's voice carried the authority of an older sister who'd spent years building her own marketing firm from nothing. You have a degree in fashion merchandising. You understand retail, profit margins, supply chains. You've been to every board meeting dinner, every investor presentation, every company party for nearly 3 decades. You know more about Harrison Fashion Group than Richard thinks you do. Margaret looked at herself in the closet mirror. Her reflection showed a woman in expensive silk pajamas, her blonde hair perfectly styled even for sleep, her skin maintained by the best dermatologist money could buy. She looked like success, like prosperity, like the wife of a millionaire. But underneath the surface, she was starting to see someone else entirely. I used to design store layouts, she said slowly. Before we got married, I was good at it. You were brilliant at it, Sarah confirmed. You could walk into any retail space and tell them exactly how to maximize profit per square foot. You think that knowledge just disappeared? Margaret stood up, pacing the small confines of her closet. Linda Cooper said I need documentation, financial records, evidence of hidden assets, proof that Richard's been planning this. Then we get it. How by being smarter than he thinks you are. Sarah's voice carried a smile. Starting tomorrow, you become the perfect wife again, interested in his business, supportive of his decisions, completely harmless, and while you're being perfect, you document everything. Margaret ended the call and sat in her closet until dawn, surrounded by the trappings of a life she was beginning to realize had never really belonged to her. When Richard's alarm sounded at 6:30, she was already downstairs making coffee, her face carefully composed into the expression of a woman who'd never overheard a midnight confession. Good morning, sweetheart, Richard said, kissing her cheek with practiced affection. Sleep well. Like a baby, Margaret replied, handing him his coffee exactly the way he preferred it. I was thinking I might stop by the office today, see how the Jakarta preparations are going. Richard paused with the cup halfway to his lips. The office, why? Margaret smiled the smile she'd perfected over 28 years of marriage. I realized I've been taking your success for granted. I'd like to understand the business better. Maybe I could help with the investor presentation. For just a moment, Richard looked genuinely pleased. That's wonderful. Margaret, I'd love to show you what we've built. What we've built? Margaret nodded and smiled and played the part of the interested wife, while her mind calculated exactly how much evidence she would need to destroy the man who thought she was too stupid to understand her own life. Outside, the morning sun burned through the clouds, and Margaret Harrison began planning her first real day of work in over 20 years. Margaret Harrison had been inside the Harrison Fashion Group offices exactly 3 times in the past 5 years, and each time only for company parties where wives were expected to smile and stay out of the way. Walking through the gleaming lobby on a Tuesday morning, she felt like an imposter in her own husband's empire. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly straight hair and the kind of confidence that came from being paid well to look beautiful, glanced up with practiced politeness. Mrs. Harrison, what a lovely surprise. Is Mr. Harrison expecting you? I wanted to surprise him, Margaret said, maintaining her perfect wife's smile. Is he in his office? He's in the conference room with the Jakarta team. Should I let him know you're here? Oh, don't interrupt him. I'll just wait in his office. The elevator ride to the executive floor gave Margaret time to study her reflection in the polished steel doors. She dressed carefully in a navy Chanel suit that Richard had bought her for their anniversary, her hair styled to perfection, her makeup applied with the precision of a woman who'd learned that appearance was armor. She looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, the successful wife of a successful man. Richard's office occupied a corner of the 23rd floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Margaret had always been impressed by the space during her rare visits, but today she looked at it with different eyes. The custom furniture, the original artwork, the Persian rug that cost more than most people's cars, all of it paid for by a company she legally owned half of but had never been invited to understand. Richard's desk was exactly what she'd expected, meticulously organized, every paper in its place, every pen aligned with military precision. His computer was password protected, but his desk calendar lay open, showing appointments and meetings in his careful handwriting. Margaret pulled out her phone and began photographing the calendar pages, her hands surprisingly steady. Jakarta meeting, Thursday, IPO strategy session, Friday. Jessica Powell, personal consultation, Saturday at 2 p.m. Personal consultation on a Saturday. Margaret stared at the entry, her perfect wife facade slipping for just a moment. What kind of personal consultation did a CEO have with his pregnant employee on weekend afternoons? Mrs. Harrison. Margaret spun around to find a woman in her 40s standing in the doorway, tall, professionally dressed, with the kind of sharp intelligence that came through in her posture. I'm Rebecca Johnson, the head of international development. I don't think we've officially met. Rebecca, Margaret slipped her phone back into her purse. Richard's mentioned you. You're handling the Jakarta expansion. Among other things, Rebecca stepped into the office, closing the door behind her. I have to say, it's unusual to see family members in the office during business hours. Something in Rebecca's tone suggested she knew exactly why Margaret was there, and it wasn't for a surprise visit. I'm trying to take more interest in the business, Margaret said carefully. Richard's been so busy lately. I'm sure he has. Rebecca moved closer, her voice dropping slightly. Mrs. Harrison, I hope you don't mind me being direct, but I think there are some things about the business you should know. Margaret's heart began to race. What kind of things? The kind of things that might affect your financial future. Before Rebecca could continue, the sound of voices in the hallway made both women freeze. Richard's laugh, unmistakable and approaching fast. We should talk, Rebecca said quickly, pulling a business card from her jacket pocket. But not here, call me. The office door opened just as Rebecca stepped back to a professional distance. Margaret. Richard's surprise seemed genuine, his smile warm and welcoming. Rebecca, I see you've met my wife. We were just discussing the international markets, Rebecca said smoothly. Mrs. Harrison was asking some very insightful questions about the Jakarta deal. Richard's smile didn't waver, but Margaret caught something flickering behind his eyes. Were you? That's wonderful, though I'm surprised you're interested in the technical details. I'm full of surprises, Margaret said, the words carrying more weight than Richard seemed to notice. I should get back to the strategy session, Rebecca said. Mrs. Harrison, it was lovely meeting you properly. After Rebecca left, Richard moved to his desk, his attention already shifting to the papers scattered across its surface. What brought you by, sweetheart? Not that I'm not delighted to see you. Margaret watched her husband settle into his chair, his movements confident and familiar. This was his domain, his kingdom, the place where he was king. But sitting across from him, she realized that kingdoms required subjects, and she'd been playing that role for far too long. I was thinking about what you said, she began, about not understanding the business. I'd like to learn. Richard looked up from his papers, his expression carefully neutral. Learn about the company, the finances, how everything works. Margaret leaned forward slightly. I realize I've been taking your success for granted. If something happened to you, I wouldn't know the first thing about protecting what we've built. For a moment, Richard looked genuinely touched. Margaret, that's actually very thoughtful, but the business is quite complex. There are legal structures, international regulations, tax implications. It's not really something you could pick up quickly. I'm smarter than you think I am. Richard, the words came out more sharply than she'd intended, and Richard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Of course you are, he said carefully. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just that business at this level requires years of experience, relationships, understanding of market forces, the kind of understanding that Jessica Powell has. Richard's pen stopped moving across the paper. What does Jessica have to do with anything? You said she's been essential to the international expansion? I was wondering what kind of experience she brings to the table. Jessica has a background in international trade. She speaks 3 languages and has connections throughout Southeast Asia. Richard's voice carried the practiced smoothness of a man who'd told this story before. She's been invaluable in developing the Jakarta relationship. Margaret nodded, filing away every word for future reference. I'd love to meet with her, learn about her approach to international markets. I don't think that's necessary, Richard said quickly. Jessica's methods are quite specialized, very technical. I see. Margaret stood up, smoothing her skirt. Well, I should let you get back to work. I know how important the Jakarta deal is. Richard was already looking back at his papers. His attention dismissed her as effectively as a door closing. I'll see you at home tonight. We can talk more about your interest in the business then. But as Margaret walked toward the elevator, she knew there would be no more conversation about her business education. Richard Harrison had no intention of teaching his wife anything that might threaten his carefully constructed empire. The elevator doors closed, and Margaret studied her reflection again. The perfect wife stared back at her, but underneath the surface, someone else was taking notes. The call came at 2:17 in the morning on a Wednesday. Margaret had been awake anyway, lying in the dark listening to Richard's breathing and planning her next conversation with Rebecca Johnson. When Richard's phone buzzed against the nightstand, she felt her entire body tense. Harrison here, Richard whispered, but his voice carried the alertness of a man who'd been expecting this call. Margaret held perfectly still, her eyes closed, her breathing carefully regulated to mimic sleep. Slow down, Richard said. What happened? The voice on the other end was female, high-pitched with panic. Even through the phone speaker, Margaret could make out words bleeding and hospital and the baby. Richard sat up abruptly. I'm on my way. He ended the call and was out of bed before Margaret could process what she'd just heard. She listened to him moving through their walk-in closet, the rustle of clothes being pulled from hangers, the soft zip of a garment bag. Where are you going? Margaret kept her voice thick with manufactured sleep. Emergency at the Jakarta facility, Richard said without hesitation. Equipment failure. I need to fly out tonight. Tonight, Richard. It's 2 in the morning. Cool time differences, he said, the lie rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. I'll be back Friday. Margaret watched through half-closed eyes as her husband packed a bag with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. He kissed her forehead before leaving, a gesture that had once meant comfort and now felt like mockery. The front door closed at 2:43. Margaret waited another 10 minutes before getting up and walking to the window that overlooked their circular driveway. Richard's BMW was gone, but instead of heading toward the airport, the taillights had turned left toward downtown, toward the hospital. Margaret stood at the window until the cold seeped through her silk nightgown, then returned to bed and stared at the ceiling until dawn. At 8 a.m., she called Rebecca Johnson. "Mrs. Harrison." Rebecca's voice was crisp and professional. "I was hoping you'd call. Can we meet today?" "Absolutely, but not at the office." "Do you know Cafe Luna on 5th Street? I'll find it. 10 o'clock. And Mrs. Harrison, come alone." Cafe Luna turned out to be a small coffee shop tucked between a bookstore and a vintage clothing boutique. The kind of place where business deals were never discussed and celebrities hid behind oversized sunglasses. Rebecca was already seated at a corner table when Margaret arrived, her dark hair pulled back severely, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for meeting me," Margaret said, sliding into the opposite chair. "I've been waiting for this conversation for months," Rebecca said without preamble. "The question is whether you're ready to hear what I have to say." Margaret wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, using the warmth to steady herself. "My husband was called away on business emergency last night. At 2 in the morning, something about equipment failure in Jakarta." Rebecca's expression didn't change. "There is no Jakarta facility, Mrs. Harrison. Harrison Fashion Group has no manufacturing presence in Indonesia. We have one supplier relationship, and they operate out of Kuala Lumpur." The coffee cup rattled against the saucer as Margaret set it down. "What? The Jakarta deal is a fiction, a very elaborate, very expensive fiction that's been used to justify multiple business trips, extended absences, and approximately $200,000 in unexplained expenses over the past 18 months. Margaret felt the cafe spinning around her. "That's impossible. Richard's shown me contracts, correspondence, all real, with a company that exists, employs 12 people, and has never manufactured a single piece of clothing." Rebecca leaned forward. "Mrs. Harrison, I've been head of international development at Harrison Fashion Group for 7 years. I know every supplier, every manufacturer, every business relationship we have. The Jakarta deal is money laundering disguised as international expansion." "Money laundering." Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. "Your husband has been systematically moving company assets into offshore accounts using fake business deals. The Jakarta operation, the European expansion, the Australian partnership, all of them are shells designed to hide money from the IRS and, I suspect, from you." Margaret stared at Rebecca, trying to process what she was hearing. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Jessica Powell came to me 6 months ago asking me to falsify export documents. When I refused, she offered me $50,000 to keep quiet about irregularities in the international accounts." Rebecca's voice hardened. "I don't know what kind of company your husband thinks he's running, but I won't be part of financial fraud. Jessica offered you money. She's not just his mistress, Mrs. Harrison. She's his partner in this operation. The pregnancy, the emotional manipulation, the public displays of affection, all of it is designed to make her seem like the victim in this situation while she helps your husband steal from his own company." Margaret felt something cold settling in her stomach. The baby is real, the ultrasound photos are real, but Jessica Powell's sob story about being an innocent employee seduced by her powerful boss, that's performance art. Rebecca reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "Jessica Powell graduated from Wharton with a degree in international finance. She's worked for 3 different companies that were later investigated for embezzlement. She was hired by Harrison Fashion Group specifically to help set up the offshore accounts." Margaret opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were copies of Jessica's real resume, employment records, and what appeared to be email correspondence between Jessica and Richard, dating back 2 years. Richard's been planning this for 2 years. Longer. The first suspicious transaction was 30 months ago. Small amounts at first, but escalating significantly over the past year. Rebecca's voice softened slightly. "Mrs. Harrison, I think you need to understand something. Your husband isn't just having an affair. He's systematically stealing from the company in preparation for disappearing with Jessica and their baby." Margaret looked up from the papers. Disappearing. The IPO announcement. That's not expansion. That's liquidation. Richard plans to take the company public, sell his shares immediately, and transfer the profits offshore. By the time the SEC figures out what happened, he and Jessica will be living very comfortably in a non-extradition country. The cafe around them continued its normal rhythm. Coffee brewing, conversations humming, the cash register chiming with each transaction. But Margaret felt as if she was sitting in the ruins of her own life, surrounded by the debris of 28 years of marriage. How much money are we talking about? Conservatively, 15 million, possibly as much as 25 million if the IPO goes according to plan. $25 million. Enough to disappear forever. Enough to buy a new identity, a new life, a new future with a young wife and a new baby. Enough to make Margaret Harrison's existence completely irrelevant. What do I do? Margaret asked. Rebecca smiled for the first time since they'd sat down. We stopped them. Mrs. Harrison, I've been documenting every suspicious transaction for 8 months. I have copies of the fake contracts, records of the offshore transfers, email evidence of the conspiracy between your husband and Jessica, but I can't do anything with it. Why not? Because I'm an employee. If I go to the authorities, Richard fires me and claims I'm a disgruntled ex-employee with a grudge. He has lawyers, connections, influence. I have a job I can't afford to lose. Margaret understood. But if his wife brings the evidence, backed by a divorce attorney and a private investigator, suddenly we're talking about a federal investigation into marital fraud. The FBI takes that very seriously. Margaret closed the folder, her hands steadier than they'd been all morning. Rebecca, I need you to copy everything. Every document, every email, every transaction record. Already done. Rebecca pulled a flash drive from her purse. Everything's on there. But Mrs. Harrison, you need to understand, once you use this information, there's no going back. Your marriage will be over. Your husband will likely go to prison, and your life as you know it will end. Margaret took the flash drive, its small weight feeling like the key to everything. My life as I know it ended the moment I found out my husband's pregnant mistress needed her dress ironed. This is just the beginning of whatever comes next. She stood up, slipping the drive into her purse next to her phone and her perfectly organized wallet. Rebecca, when this is over, would you be interested in running international development for a company with honest accounting practices? Rebecca's smile was fierce and bright. Mrs. Harrison, I thought you'd never ask. Linda Cooper's law office occupied the 15th floor of a downtown high-rise, its reception area decorated with the kind of understated elegance that whispered expensive without shouting about it. Margaret sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, clutching Rebecca's flash drive like a talisman. Mrs. Harrison. The receptionist's voice was professionally warm. Ms. Cooper will see you now. Linda Cooper looked exactly like a lawyer who specialized in high-stakes divorces should look mid-40s. Steel gray hair pulled into a perfect chignon, wearing a charcoal suit that suggested both authority and discretion. Her handshake was firm, her office was immaculate, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd spent years dismantling the carefully constructed lies of powerful men. Mrs. Harrison, please sit down. Linda gestured toward a pair of chairs arranged in front of her desk. I understand you have some new information since our last conversation. Margaret set the flash drive on Linda's desk. My husband has been stealing from his own company to fund his disappearance with his pregnant mistress. I have documentation. Linda's expression didn't change, but she leaned forward slightly. That's a serious accusation. What kind of documentation? For the next hour. Margaret walked Linda through everything Rebecca had shown her. The fake Jakarta deal, the offshore accounts, Jessica's real background, the planned IPO liquidation. Linda made notes in a precise legal shorthand, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated exactly how seriously she was taking the situation. Mrs. Harrison, Linda said when Margaret finished, what you're describing isn't just marital infidelity. It's conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and potentially tax evasion. We're talking about federal charges. Good. Linda's eyebrows rose slightly. Good. Richard Harrison spent 28 years making me feel like I was too stupid to understand business, too naive to handle real-world complexity, too comfortable in my protected little bubble to survive without him. Margaret's voice was steady, but Linda could hear steel underneath. Turns out I'm smart enough to catch him stealing $25 million. I'd say that makes me plenty qualified to handle the real world. Linda smiled, and for the first time, Margaret saw approval in the lawyer's expression. Mrs. Harrison, I think you're going to be surprised by how capable you really are. But before we proceed, I need you to understand what we're dealing with. Your husband isn't just a cheating spouse. He's a criminal who's been planning this for years. When we move against him, he's going to fight back with everything he has. What does that mean? It means he'll try to paint you as an unstable wife seeking revenge. He'll question your mental health, your credibility, your motivations. He'll claim you're bitter about the affair and making up stories to hurt him. Linda's voice carried the authority of experience. Men like Richard Harrison don't go quietly. They burn everything down on their way out. Margaret thought about the midnight phone calls, the casual dismissal of her intelligence, the expectation that she would iron another woman's dress. Let him try. I've been living in the ashes for years. The only difference is now I'm holding the matches. Linda opened a legal pad and began writing. Here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to have this evidence analyzed by a forensic accountant. I know someone who specializes in complex financial fraud, Frank Morrison. He's expensive, but he's the best. Money's not an issue, Margaret said. I still have access to the joint accounts, and Richard's so confident I'm clueless that he hasn't bothered to hide his spending. Good. Frank will need to trace every transaction, document every offshore transfer, and build an airtight case against your husband and Jessica. Linda made another note. Second, we're going to file for divorce immediately, but we're not going to mention the fraud evidence yet. I want Richard to think this is just a standard infidelity case. Why? Because the moment he knows we have evidence of financial crimes, he'll start covering his tracks. Right now, he thinks he's safe. He thinks you're too naive to understand what he's been doing. We want to keep him thinking that until we're ready to destroy him. Margaret nodded, understanding the strategy. How long do we have? According to the documents you've shown me, the IPO announcement is scheduled for next month. Once that happens, Richard can start liquidating assets legally. We need to move fast. Linda picked up her phone and dialed a number from memory. Frank, it's Linda Cooper. I have a case for you. Yes, it's urgent. How soon can you meet with my client? While Linda arranged the meeting with Frank Morrison, Margaret stared out the office windows at the city sprawling below. Somewhere down there, Richard was probably having lunch with investors, playing the role of successful CEO while planning to steal millions of dollars. Somewhere down there, Jessica was probably shopping for baby clothes with money that rightfully belonged to the company. And somewhere down there, Margaret Harrison was about to become someone neither of them expected her to be. Frank can meet us tomorrow morning at 9, Linda said, hanging up the phone. Mrs. Harrison, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. What do you want the end result to be? Do you want your husband punished? Do you want to save the company? Do you want financial independence? Do you want revenge? Linda's voice was gentle but direct. Because the choices we make in the next few weeks will determine which of those goals we can achieve. Margaret thought about the question, but the answer came immediately. I want women supporting women. I want to build something honest. I want to make sure that what Richard did to me never happens to anyone else. That's not revenge talking. No, Margaret said. That's business. Linda Cooper smiled, and Margaret realized it was the first time in months that someone had looked at her with genuine respect. Mrs. Harrison, I think we're going to work very well together. Now, let's go destroy your husband's criminal empire and build you a better life. As Margaret left the law office, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of having real work to do. Tomorrow she would meet with a forensic accountant. Next week, she would file for divorce. And somewhere in the near future, Richard Harrison was going to discover that his perfect wife had turned into his perfect nightmare. The elevator doors closed, and Margaret Harrison began planning the most important business strategy of her life. Frank Morrison looked like a man who'd spent his career following money trails through the darkest corners of corporate America. Tall, graying, with the kind of lined face that suggested he'd seen every creative way humans could steal from each other. He sat across from Margaret in Linda Cooper's conference room with Rebecca's flash drive connected to his laptop. "Mrs. Harrison," Frank said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that spoke of too many late nights and too much coffee. "Your husband is either a criminal mastermind or the luckiest amateur I've ever encountered." "Which one?" Margaret asked. "Amateur. A really good financial criminal would never leave this much evidence lying around." Frank turned his laptop screen toward Margaret and Linda. "Look at this transaction from 6 months ago. $200,000 transferred to something called Jakarta Development Partners, except the routing number leads to a bank in the Cayman Islands, and the company address is a post office box in Delaware." Margaret stared at the screen. "He didn't even try to hide it. He hid it from you," Linda said. "But he didn't hide it from anyone who actually knew how to look. Richard assumed his wife would never think to examine the company finances." Frank clicked to another screen. "Here's what really interesting, though. Jessica Powell has been making deposits to her personal account that correspond exactly to these offshore transfers. She's not just helping him steal the money, she's being paid a percentage." "How much?" Margaret asked. 10% of everything. Over the past 18 months, Jessica Powell has received approximately $2.3 million in what I can only call theft commissions." Margaret felt her anger crystallizing into something cold and sharp. "So while she was playing the innocent pregnant mistress, she was actually Richard's business partner in stealing from the company I legally own half of." "Exactly." Frank pulled up another screen. "And here's the beautiful part. Every payment to Jessica is documented in Richard's personal banking records. He's been treating her like a business expense and deducting the payments on his taxes." Linda laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "He's been claiming tax deductions for paying his mistress to help him commit fraud." "Mrs. Harrison, your husband isn't just a criminal. He's a stupid criminal." "What does this mean for our case?" Margaret asked. "It means we have enough evidence to send both Richard and Jessica to federal prison for 10 to 15 years, Frank said. "But more importantly for you, it means we can freeze every asset, recover every stolen dollar, and make sure you get everything you're legally entitled to." Margaret looked at the numbers on Frank's screen. Millions of dollars that should have been reinvested in the company, should have been part of their legitimate business success, should have secured their future instead of funding Richard's escape plan. "There's something else," Frank said, clicking to a new document. "Richard's been borrowing against the company's future earnings to fund his current lifestyle. If the IPO fails, and it will, once this comes to light, Harrison Fashion Group will be in serious financial trouble." "How serious?" "Bankruptcy serious. Unless someone with actual business acumen takes control and restructures the debt." Margaret felt a familiar stirring, the same sensation she'd experienced years ago when walking through struggling retail spaces and seeing exactly how to fix them. The company can be saved, with the right leadership and the recovered, stolen assets. Absolutely. Harrison Fashion Group has solid fundamentals, good relationships with legitimate suppliers, strong brand recognition, loyal customer base. The problem isn't the business model. The problem is the CEO. Linda made a note on her legal pad. "Mrs. Harrison, we need to talk about timing. How soon can you complete your analysis?" "Frank, I can have a complete forensic accounting report ready in 10 days, but I'd recommend moving sooner on freezing the assets. Every day we wait is another day Richard can transfer money offshore." "What do you need from me?" Margaret asked. Frank and Linda exchanged a look that Margaret had learned to recognize, the look of professionals who were about to ask their client to do something difficult. "We need you to go home and act normal," Linda said. "We need Richard to think everything is fine while we prepare to destroy his life." "For how long?" "1 week. Can you do that? Can you go home tonight, kiss your husband hello, ask about his day, and pretend you don't know he's a criminal who's been planning to abandon you for 2 years?" Margaret thought about 28 years of pretending. 28 years of course, and whatever you think is best, and I don't really understand business. 28 years of being the perfect wife while her husband systematically planned her destruction. "I've been practicing for this role my entire marriage," she said. "1 more week should be easy." But as Margaret left Linda's office building and walked toward her car, She realized that 1 week of pretending to be oblivious might be the hardest performance of her life, because now she knew exactly who Richard Harrison really was, and acting like she didn't know was going to require every ounce of self-control she possessed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Home late tonight. Important dinner with Jakarta investors. Don't wait up." Margaret stared at the message. Knowing it was almost certainly a lie, Richard was probably having dinner with Jessica, discussing their plans for the future, celebrating how close they were to their goal of disappearing with $25 million. She typed back, "Of course, darling. I'll keep dinner warm just in case." The perfect wife response. But as Margaret drove home through the evening traffic, she was already planning her transformation into something Richard Harrison would never see coming. The Harrison Fashion Group board meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m., and Margaret Harrison had never attended one in 28 years of marriage. When she walked into the conference room wearing a midnight blue power suit and carrying a leather briefcase, the 12 members of the board looked at her with expressions ranging from surprise to curiosity to barely concealed condescension. "Gentlemen," Richard said, his voice carrying only the slightest strain, "I'd like you to meet my wife, Margaret. She's expressed interest in learning more about our operations." Margaret smiled the smile she'd perfected for company parties and charity galas. "Thank you for including me. I know how valuable your time is." She took the empty chair at the far end of the conference table, directly opposite Richard's position at the head. From here, she could see every face, watch every reaction, observe the dynamics that had shaped her husband's empire. "We were just discussing the IPO timeline," said Gerald Metis, the board chairman and Richard's longtime friend. "Richard's optimistic about the market reception. The institutional investors are very excited," Richard said, clicking to his first PowerPoint slide. "Based on current projections, we're looking at an opening price of $42 per share, which would value the company at approximately $60 million. Margaret made a note in the leather portfolio Linda had given her, her handwriting carefully feminine and decorative. To anyone watching, she looked like a wife trying to understand her husband's business. In reality, she was documenting every claim Richard made about the company's value and future prospects. "What about the international expansion?" asked board member Patricia Wong, the only other woman in the room. "I know Jakarta has been a major focus." Margaret watched Richard's face carefully as he answered. "Jakarta represents our largest growth opportunity. We're projecting $15 million in revenue from the Southeast Asian market in the first quarter alone. $15 million that didn't exist, from a facility that had never been built, through partnerships that were entirely fictional." Margaret wrote down every number, every projection, every lie her husband told with complete confidence. "Margaret," Gerald Mathis said, turning toward her with the patronizing smile she'd seen at dozens of dinner parties. "What do you think of your husband's international strategy?" It was meant to be a softball question, an opportunity for the CEO's wife to say something supportive and harmless. Instead, Margaret leaned forward slightly and spoke with the clear diction of someone who expected to be taken seriously. "I think international expansion requires significant due diligence," she said, "particularly in markets with complex regulatory environments and unfamiliar manufacturing standards." The room went quiet. Several board members glanced at Richard, who maintained his composed expression with visible effort. "Of course," Gerald said. "Richard's always been very thorough about due diligence." "I'm sure he has," Margaret agreed. "I'd love to see the compliance reports from our Jakarta partners. Environmental standards, labor practices, quality control measures. I imagine we have extensive documentation." Richard's pen stopped moving across his notepad. "Those reports are quite technical, sweetheart. Mostly regulatory language that would be difficult to follow without industry background." "I have a degree in fashion merchandising," Margaret said pleasantly. "I think I can manage regulatory language." The silence stretched for several seconds before Richard moved on to his next slide. But Margaret had achieved exactly what she'd come for. She'd established herself as someone who asked inconvenient questions, and she'd done it in front of witnesses. After the meeting, Margaret lingered in the conference room while the board members filed out, making small talk and exchanging business cards. Patricia Wong approached her with genuine curiosity. "Margaret, I had no idea you had a background in fashion merchandising. Have you considered taking a more active role in the company?" "I'm starting to think about it," Margaret said. It's time I stopped taking Richard's success for granted. Patricia glanced toward the door where Richard was speaking intently with Gerald Mattis. If you ever want to discuss the business from a different perspective, I'd be happy to have coffee. Sometimes it helps to talk with someone who understands the challenges of being a woman in this industry. Margaret accepted Patricia's business card, recognizing an unexpected ally. I'd like that very much. That evening, Richard was unusually quiet during dinner. Margaret served his favorite meal, lamb with rosemary, roasted vegetables, wine from their private collection, and maintained cheerful conversation about her day, the weather, plans for the weekend. But underneath the domestic normalcy, she could feel his tension like a live wire. How did you like the board meeting? Richard finally asked. It was fascinating, Margaret said. I had no idea the business was so complex. All those international regulations and compliance requirements. Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth. You seem very interested in the Jakarta documentation. Well, $15 million is a significant investment. I was curious about how we verify our partner's capabilities. Dalsha Margaret took a sip of wine, her expression innocent. I assume we have site inspections, third-party audits, all the standard due diligence procedures. Of course we do. I'd love to see the reports sometime. Since I'm learning about the business, it would help me understand how international partnerships work. Richard set down his fork entirely. Margaret, I appreciate your interest, but these are proprietary documents, confidential business information that can't be shared outside the executive team. I'm your wife, Richard, and according to our marriage contract, I'm also a 50% owner of Harrison Fashion Group. Doesn't that make me part of the executive team? For the first time in 28 years of marriage, Margaret watched her husband look genuinely afraid. Sweetheart, he said carefully, business ownership and business operations are two different things. Just because you legally own shares doesn't mean you're qualified to make operational decisions. Suckum. Margaret smiled the same smile she'd been perfecting for decades. Of course not. I wouldn't want to interfere with your expertise. I'm just trying to educate myself about my own investments. But as they finished dinner in careful, polite conversation, Margaret knew that Richard Harrison had received her message loud and clear. His perfect wife wasn't quite as naive as he'd believed, and she was asking questions he couldn't answer without revealing the criminal conspiracy that had funded their lifestyle for the past 2 years. The next morning, Margaret received a text from an unknown number, documentation ready for review. If Frank Morrison had completed his forensic analysis, it was time to stop pretending and start destroying the man who'd spent 28 years underestimating her intelligence. The Harrison Fashion Group boardroom had hosted 1,000 meetings over the years, but never one quite like this. Margaret Harrison sat at the head of the conference table, Richard's usual seat, wearing a charcoal gray suit that made her look like exactly what she was, a woman who owned half of everything in the room. Linda Cooper sat to her right, her legal documents arranged with military precision. Frank Morrison sat to her left, his laptop open to spreadsheets that would destroy 2 lives and save a company. At the far end of the table, the 12 board members who'd been summoned for an emergency meeting waited with expressions ranging from confusion to concern. Richard wasn't there yet. He didn't know about the meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret began, her voice carrying an authority she'd never used in public before. Thank you for coming on such short notice. I know this is unusual, but I've discovered some information about Harrison Fashion Group that requires immediate board attention. Gerald Mathis shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Margaret, shouldn't we wait for Richard? These are company matters that really require the CEO's input. The CEO is the reason we're here, Linda said, opening her first folder. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Linda Cooper, and I represent Mrs. Harrison in both personal and business matters. What I'm about to show you constitutes evidence of criminal fraud committed by Richard Harrison against this company and its shareholders. The room went dead silent. Patricia Wong leaned forward. What kind of fraud? Frank Morrison turned his laptop screen toward the board. Over the past 30 months, Richard Harrison has systematically embezzled approximately $22 million from Harrison Fashion Group through fake international business deals. That's impossible, Gerald said. Richard wouldn't. The Jakarta expansion project doesn't exist. Frank continued. Jakarta Development Partners is a shell company with no employees, no facilities, and no actual business operations. Every dollar sent to Jakarta has been transferred to offshore accounts controlled by Richard Harrison and Jessica Powell. Margaret watched the faces around the table as Frank walked through his evidence. The disbelief, the anger, the dawning realization that they'd been betrayed by someone they'd trusted completely. Several board members were taking notes. Others were asking sharp questions about specific transactions. And Gerald Mattis looked like a man watching his oldest friend revealed as a stranger. Jessica Powell, Patricia said, isn't she the pregnant employee who's been helping with international development? Jessica Powell is Richard Harrison's partner in this conspiracy, Linda said, pulling out another folder. She has a background in financial fraud and was hired specifically to help establish the offshore accounts. Her pregnancy and romantic relationship with Mr. Harrison are designed to make her appear sympathetic while she systematically steals from this company. The boardroom door burst open with the force of Richard's dramatic entrance. He strode into the room with his usual commanding presence, his expensive suit immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled. But when he saw Margaret sitting in his chair, flanked by lawyers and accountants, his composure cracked just slightly. "What the hell is this?" Richard demanded. Margaret looked at her husband with the calm expression of someone who'd been planning this moment for weeks. "Hello, Richard. We were just discussing your creative approach to international finance." Richard's eyes swept the room, taking in Linda's legal documents, Frank's financial evidence, the grim faces of board members who'd been his allies for years. "Margaret, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this is a business meeting. You have no authority here." "Actually," Linda said, standing up, "Mrs. Harrison has every authority here. As a 50% owner of Harrison Fashion Group, she has the right to call emergency board meetings, examine company finances, and present evidence of criminal misconduct to the board." Richard turned to Gerald Mattis. "Gerald, you can't let her do this. Margaret doesn't understand business. She's obviously been manipulated by lawyers who are trying to profit from our marriage problems." "Richard," Gerald said quietly, "we've seen the evidence. The fake contracts, the offshore transfers, the shell companies. How do you explain $22 million in fraudulent transactions?" For the first time in 30 years of knowing Richard Harrison, Margaret watched her husband struggle for words. His mouth opened and closed silently, his perfect composure finally cracking under the weight of documented proof. "Those are legitimate business expenses," he finally managed. "International development requires complex financial structures. Margaret couldn't possibly understand the regulatory requirements." "Richard," Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying a steel that made everyone in the room look at her with new attention. "You asked me to iron your mistress's dress? Instead, I press charges." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Several board members gasped. Gerald Mattis actually flinched. "You can't do this," Richard said, his voice rising. "This company is mine. Everything we built together. We built nothing together. Richard, I built a life while you built lies." Margaret stood up, her height advantage over her seated husband suddenly symbolic of the power shift happening in real time. "You spent 28 years convincing me I was too stupid to understand business. Turns out I'm smart enough to catch you stealing $25 million. The boardroom door opened again, and Jessica Powell walked in with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything she wanted. Her pregnancy was clearly visible now, her designer maternity dress probably costing more than most people's monthly salaries. She moved toward Richard with possessive certainty. "Richard, what's going on? Your assistant said there was an emergency?" Jessica stopped talking when she saw Margaret's face. For the first time since the affair began, the two women looked directly at each other with complete understanding of exactly who the other person was. "Jessica," Margaret said pleasantly, "how lovely to see you. We were just discussing your 10% commission on the money you and Richard stole from my company." Jessica's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." Frank Morrison turned his laptop toward her. $2.3 million deposited into your personal accounts over 18 months. Every payment corresponds exactly to offshore transfers from Harrison Fashion Group. You've been very thorough about documenting your theft." "Richard," Jessica's voice carried the first hint of panic. "Richard, What is she talking about? But Richard was staring at Margaret with an expression she'd never seen before. Genuine fear mixed with something that might have been respect. How? He asked quietly. You underestimated me, Margaret said. For 28 years. You told me I was too naive to understand the real world. Too comfortable to survive without you. Too stupid to see what was happening right in front of me. She smiled, and for the first time in years, it was completely genuine. You were wrong about everything. Linda Cooper cleared her throat. Mr. Harrison, Ms. Powell, I should inform you that federal charges are being filed this afternoon for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. The FBI will be issuing arrest warrants within the hour. Jessica made a sound like a wounded animal. Richard, you said this was legal. You said it was just business restructuring. Shut up, Richard snapped, his mask finally falling completely away. Just shut up. But Jessica was beyond reason now, her carefully constructed persona crumbling as quickly as Richard's had. You told me Margaret was too stupid to figure it out. You said she'd never think to look at the finances. I said, shut up. Margaret watched her husband and his pregnant mistress turn on each other with the vicious efficiency of people who'd never actually loved anyone but themselves. All the romantic drama, all the emotional manipulation, all the careful positioning of Jessica as the innocent victim, it dissolved in less than 30 seconds when real consequences appeared. Gerald Mathis stood up slowly. The board needs to vote. All in favor of removing Richard Harrison as CEO of Harrison Fashion Group. 12 hands rose simultaneously. All in favor of appointing Margaret Harrison as interim CEO pending criminal investigation. 12 hands rose again. Margaret looked around the boardroom at the people who'd just handed her control of a multi-million-dollar company. For 28 years, she'd been decoration in rooms like this. Now she was the person making the decisions. Thank you, she said. The first order of business is recovering every stolen dollar and rebuilding this company's reputation. Linda, please coordinate with the FBI to freeze all offshore accounts. Frank, I need a complete audit of our legitimate business operations. We're going to save Harrison Fashion Group, and we're going to do it honestly. Security guards appeared in the doorway. Linda had planned for everything. Mr. Harrison, Ms. Powell, one of the guards said politely, you'll need to come with us. As Richard and Jessica were escorted from the building, Margaret remained in the boardroom, surrounded by the evidence of her victory and the wreckage of her old life. Patricia Wong approached her with something that looked like admiration. Margaret, she said, that was the most impressive corporate coup I've ever witnessed. How long have you been planning this? Margaret looked out the boardroom windows at the city spreading below her. Somewhere down there, federal agents were preparing arrest warrants. Somewhere down there, Richard Harrison's criminal empire was collapsing. Somewhere down there, a new life was beginning. All my life, she said. I just didn't know it until now. 6 months after the boardroom confrontation that destroyed her marriage and saved her company, Margaret Harrison stood in her corner office on the 23rd floor of the Harrison Fashion Group building, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and possibility. The brass nameplate on her desk read, Chief Executive Officer, and every morning when she saw it, she felt the same quiet satisfaction of someone who'd earned something honestly. Her morning routine had changed dramatically since becoming CEO. Instead of waking up in a suburban mansion to make coffee for a man who saw her as decorative furniture, Margaret now lived in a downtown penthouse and began each day reviewing financial reports that actually made sense. No more offshore accounts. No more fictional partnerships. No more money disappearing into the Caribbean banking system. Good morning, Mrs. Harrison, her assistant David Williams said, appearing in her doorway with the perfect timing that had made him invaluable over the past months. The quarterly reports are ready for your review. David Williams had been Harrison Fashion Group's head of accounting during Richard's reign, but unlike his former boss, David believed in revolutionary concepts like accurate bookkeeping and paying taxes. He was also 42 years old, divorced, kind, intelligent, and possessed the rare quality of treating Margaret like an actual human being instead of an ornamental object. Thank you, David. Margaret accepted the reports with genuine pleasure. How do we look better than expected? Revenue was up 18% from last quarter, and we've recovered approximately $19 million of the stolen assets. David's smile was professionally warm. But Margaret had learned to recognize the personal interest underneath. The federal prosecutors say Richard and Jessica's trial should conclude next month. Margaret nodded, though she'd stopped following the criminal proceedings closely. Richard Harrison's legal troubles were no longer her concern. She had a company to run, employees to protect, and a future to build that had nothing to do with the man who'd spent 28 years underestimating her intelligence. "Any word from the Jakarta situation?" she asked, settling behind her desk with the reports. "The real Jakarta partnership is moving forward beautifully. Turns out there actually is demand for American fashion in Southeast Asia. We just needed legitimate business partners instead of fictional ones." David's tone carried the dry humor that had helped Margaret navigate the transition from neglected wife to successful CEO. "Rebecca Johnson sends her regards from Kuala Lumpur. She says the manufacturing facilities exceed all our quality standards." Rebecca Johnson, now Harrison Fashion Group's Senior Vice President of International Development, had spent the past 3 months establishing actual business relationships in Southeast Asia. Real factories, real workers, real products, real profits. Revolutionary concepts in the post-Richard era. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Lunch today, I have news about the foundation." The Harrison Foundation for Women's Financial Independence had been Margaret's idea. Funded by the recovered stolen assets and designed to provide business education, legal resources, and startup capital for women leaving abusive marriages. It was the kind of project Richard would have dismissed as emotional nonsense, which made Margaret even more determined to make it succeed. "David, can you move my 2 o'clock meeting to 3:30? I'm having lunch with my sister." "Of course. But before you go, there's something else." David's expression shifted slightly, becoming more personal than professional. "I know this isn't really my place, but I wanted to say something about how you've handled everything." Margaret looked up from the quarterly reports. "What do you mean? I worked for your husband for 7 years. I watched him treat employees like disposable resources, manipulate board members, and ignore ethical guidelines whenever they inconvenienced him." David's voice carried the weight of someone who'd witnessed systematic misconduct. "You've been CEO for 6 months, and already this feels like a completely different company. People actually enjoy coming to work now." Margaret felt the familiar warmth of genuine accomplishment. "Thank you, David. That means more than you know." "There's something else." David moved closer to her desk, his professional demeanor giving way to something more personal. "I was wondering if you might be interested in having dinner sometime. Nothing work-related, just dinner." For 28 years, Margaret had been married to a man who saw her as a beautiful accessory to his successful life. The idea of dating someone who valued her intelligence, her business acumen, her actual personality, felt like stepping into a completely foreign country. "I'd like that," she said, and realized she meant it completely. David's smile was worth the months of legal battles, financial stress, and public humiliation she'd endured to get to this moment. Saturday at 7. Perfect. After David left, Margaret returned to the quarterly reports with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. The numbers told a story of recovery, growth, and honest success. Harrison Fashion Group was becoming the company it should have been all along. Profitable, ethical, and built on actual business relationships instead of criminal conspiracies. Her office phone rang with the specific tone that indicated an internal call. "Margaret?" Patricia Wong's voice carried excitement. "Turn on Channel 7, the business news segment." Margaret grabbed her remote and switched to the local business channel, where a perfectly coiffed anchor was reading from a teleprompter with professional enthusiasm. Harrison Fashion Group announced record quarterly profits today, marking the 6th consecutive month of growth under new CEO Margaret Harrison. The company, which was nearly destroyed by an embezzlement scandal earlier this year, has become a model for corporate recovery and ethical business practices. The screen switched to footage of Margaret speaking at a recent business conference, her voice confident and clear as she discussed sustainable manufacturing and responsible international partnerships. Watching herself on television, Margaret barely recognized the woman who'd once ironed another woman's dress on command. Industry analysts credit Harrison's dramatic turnaround to Margaret Harrison's hands-on leadership style and commitment to transparency. The anchor continued. Harrison Fashion Group's stock price has increased 47% since Mrs. Harrison assumed control of the company. Margaret turned off the television and looked around her office. The space that had once belonged to Richard Harrison, with its expensive furniture and carefully curated art collection, now reflected her personality and priorities. Photos of employees at the Jakarta facilities, thank you letters from women who'd received grants from the foundation, financial charts that showed steady, honest growth instead of fictional international partnerships. Her desk phone rang again, this time with an external call. Harrison Fashion Group, Margaret Harrison speaking. Mrs. Harrison. The voice was young, nervous, hopeful. My name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm calling about the Foundation's business education program. I was wondering if there might be space in the next class. Margaret pulled up the Foundation's enrollment database on her computer. Tell me about your situation. Jennifer. I've been married for 15 years to a man who controls all our finances. I just discovered he's been hiding money from me, and I think he's planning to leave me with nothing. I don't have a college degree. I've been out of the workforce for 12 years, and I don't know how to protect myself. Margaret felt the familiar combination of anger and determination that drove her foundation work. Jennifer, can you come in tomorrow morning at 10? I'd like to meet with you personally. Really, you'd meet with me yourself? Absolutely. We're going to teach you everything you need to know about protecting your financial future. Margaret made a note in her calendar. And Jennifer, you're going to be surprised by how capable you really are. After ending the call, Margaret stood at her office windows and looked out at the city where her new life was taking shape. Somewhere down there, Richard Harrison was preparing for a criminal trial that would probably send him to federal prison. Somewhere down there, Jessica Powell was learning that pregnant women don't receive special treatment from the FBI. Somewhere down there, women like Jennifer Walsh were discovering that marriages built on financial control were just elaborate prisons with better decorating. But up here, on the 23rd floor of a building that now belonged to her in every way that mattered, Margaret Harrison was building something that would outlast any individual marriage, any personal revenge, any single story of betrayal and recovery. She was building an empire based on the radical concept that women supporting women could change everything. 1 year after the day she burned Jessica Powell's silk dress in her kitchen, Margaret Harrison woke up in her downtown penthouse to the sound of rain against floor-to-ceiling windows and the distant hum of a city that had become her kingdom. Her morning routine bore no resemblance to the suburban ritual of coffee and submission that had defined the previous 28 years of her life. At 54, Margaret Harrison had become exactly what Richard had always feared: she might be a woman who didn't need him for anything. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from Linda Cooper, 4 text messages from Sarah, and 17 emails marked urgent. But the most important notification was the news alert that made her smile as she read it over her first cup of coffee. Former CEO Richard Harrison sentenced to 7 years for embezzlement and fraud. The accompanying article mentioned that Jessica Powell had received 5 years and would be entering prison 3 months after giving birth to a daughter who would be raised by Jessica's mother in Ohio. The baby, who had been conceived as part of an elaborate criminal conspiracy, would grow up far from the wealth and privilege her parents had stolen to fund their future. Margaret felt no satisfaction in their punishment, only the quiet relief of closure. Richard Harrison was no longer her concern. Jessica Powell was no longer her problem. The past was finally, completely finished. Her penthouse apartment reflected the woman she'd become rather than the wife she'd been. Clean lines, natural light, books about business strategy instead of decorating magazines. Art chosen for its beauty rather than its price tag. Furniture that served function rather than display. A space designed for someone who worked, thought, and built things rather than someone who waited for other people to make decisions. The Harrison Foundation occupied 3 floors of a downtown building, its reception area decorated with photos of women who'd completed the business education program. Success stories of 50-something women who'd discovered they possessed capabilities their husbands had spent decades convincing them they didn't have. Margaret walked through the foundation offices every morning, and every morning she was reminded that her personal transformation had become a template for dozens of other women's liberation. "Good morning, Margaret," Sarah called from the foundation's conference room. "Ready for your television interview." The interview was for a national business program profiling successful female CEOs. Margaret had initially resisted the publicity, but Sarah had convinced her that visibility mattered. Women needed to see what was possible. They needed proof that divorce settlement victories were about more than money. They were about reclaiming power that had always belonged to them. "How do I look?" Margaret asked, smoothing her navy blue suit, the same suit she'd worn to destroy Richard's criminal empire, now serving as armor for a different kind of battle. "Like someone who could run the world," Sarah said. "Which, let's be honest, you basically are." The television crew arrived at 10, transforming the Foundation's conference room into a professional studio. Margaret had given dozens of interviews over the past year, but she still felt a moment of surreal amazement at seeing herself taken seriously by reporters who treated her as an authority rather than decoration. "Mrs. Harrison," the interviewer began, "Harrison Fashion Group has become a model for corporate recovery. How did you transform a company that was nearly destroyed by fraud into one of the most profitable fashion businesses in the region?" Margaret had answered this question many times, but the answer never lost its power. "We focused on honest relationships, honest partnerships with suppliers, honest communication with employees, honest accounting practices. It turns out that running a business ethically isn't just morally superior, it's also more profitable. Your foundation has helped over 200 women start new businesses or escape financially abusive marriages. What drives that work?" Margaret looked directly into the camera, knowing that somewhere women like Jennifer Walsh were watching and wondering if change was possible. "I spent 28 years believing I was too naive to understand business, too comfortable to survive independently, too old to start over. Every woman who completes our program proves those beliefs were lies designed to keep capable people powerless." After the interview, Margaret returned to her Harrison Fashion Group office to find David Williams waiting with champagne and a financial report that made her laugh out loud. "43 million in revenue this quarter," David said, pouring champagne into crystal glasses. "We officially exceeded Richard's best year, and we did it without stealing a single dollar." Margaret accepted her glass and raised it in a toast. "To honest profits and women supporting women? To the most impressive CEO I've ever worked for," David replied, and the kiss that followed tasted like victory and possibility and the kind of future Margaret had never imagined when she was ironing another woman's dress. Their relationship had developed with the careful respect of two people who'd both learned that trust was earned rather than assumed. David understood that Margaret's independence wasn't negotiable, and Margaret had discovered that partnership with an equal felt nothing like the submission she'd mistaken for marriage. "There's something else," David said, setting down his champagne glass. "The board unanimously approved your proposal for the employee profit-sharing program. Starting next quarter, every Harrison Fashion Group employee will receive a percentage of company profits based on their tenure and performance." Margaret felt the familiar satisfaction of implementing ideas that Richard would have dismissed as financially irresponsible. Treating employees like human beings instead of disposable resources had resulted in the lowest turnover rate in the company's history and the highest productivity numbers on record. And the Jakarta expansion. Rebecca's team has established partnerships with 12 manufacturers across Southeast Asia. All of them meet our labor standards, environmental requirements, and quality specifications. David pulled up a map on his tablet showing the real Harrison Fashion Group international presence. "We're projecting $60 million in international revenue next year, $60 million in actual profits from actual business relationships." Margaret remembered Richard's fictional $15 million from his imaginary Jakarta partnerships and realized that honesty had turned out to be far more profitable than fraud. Her office door opened with the particular energy that announced Sarah's arrival. Margaret's sister had appointed herself unofficial chief operating officer of Margaret's new life, a role that involved everything from managing foundation logistics to screening Margaret's social invitations to ensuring she remembered to eat lunch. "Margaret, you have a visitor," Sarah said, stepping aside to reveal a young woman with a baby carrier and the kind of determined expression Margaret recognized from her own mirror. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm Jennifer Walsh. We met last year when I called about the foundation program." Margaret stood up, moving around her desk to greet the woman whose midnight phone call had been one of hundreds she'd taken from women discovering their husbands' financial betrayals. "Jennifer, how wonderful to see you." "I wanted to thank you," Jennifer said, shifting the baby carrier to reveal a sleeping infant, "and to show you what's possible." Jennifer Walsh had completed the foundation's 6-month business education program, divorced her financially abusive husband, won a significant settlement, and used the money to start an online clothing boutique that specialized in professional wear for working mothers. Her business was projected to gross $300,000 in its first year. "This is Emma," Jennifer said, adjusting the baby's blanket. "Named after your daughter. I hope you don't mind." Margaret felt tears threatening for the first time in months. "I'm honored. The foundation changed my life," Jennifer continued. "But more than that, you showed me that being 50-something doesn't mean being finished. It means being experienced enough to build something that lasts." After Jennifer left, Margaret stood in her office surrounded by the evidence of transformation. Financial reports showing honest profits, thank you letters from foundation graduates, photos of employees at facilities that actually existed, business partnerships built on mutual respect rather than criminal conspiracy. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma and Michael, her twins who'd initially struggled with their parents' divorce, but had gradually come to understand that their mother's liberation had been necessary for everyone's well-being. "Mom, saw your interview on TV. So proud of you. Dad called from prison asking us to visit, but we told him we're busy building something with you instead." Margaret smiled, remembering the frightened woman who'd once worried that her children would blame her for destroying their family. Instead, Emma and Michael had watched their mother transform from decoration into dynamo and decided they wanted to be part of whatever she built next. The afternoon brought a board meeting where Margaret presented plans for the Harrison Fashion Group's expansion into sustainable manufacturing, the foundation's new program for women over 60 starting their first businesses, and the scholarship fund that would send the daughters of company employees to college regardless of their family's financial circumstances. Patricia Wong raised her hand during the presentation. "Margaret, these initiatives will cost approximately $2 million in the first year. Are you certain about the return on investment?" Margaret looked around the boardroom at faces that had once dismissed her as Richard's decorative wife. "Patricia, we're not just investing in business expansion. We're investing in the radical concept that taking care of people is profitable. Our employee retention rate is 97%. Our customer loyalty scores are the highest in the industry. Our reputation for ethical business practices has opened doors that money alone could never have unlocked." The board voted unanimously to approve all three initiatives. As evening approached, Margaret remained in her office reviewing the day's accomplishments and planning tomorrow's strategies. The city sparkled below her windows, each light representing someone building something, working towards something, hoping for something better. Her desk phone rang with an external call. "Harrison Fashion Group, Margaret Harrison speaking." "Mrs. Harrison." The voice was older, uncertain, hopeful. "My name is Ruth Peterson. I'm 62 years old, and I just found out my husband has been hiding money from me for 30 years. I saw your interview today, and I wondered, is it too late for someone like me to start over?" Margaret pulled up the foundation's intake database, already knowing that Ruth Peterson would join the growing community of women who discovered that the end of one life could be the beginning of something far better. "Ruth," Margaret said, "it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Can you come in tomorrow morning? I'd like to meet with you personally." After ending the call, Margaret walked to her office windows and looked out at the city that had become the center of her empire. Not an empire built on theft and lies like Richard's had been, but an empire built on the revolutionary idea that treating people honestly was both morally right and fantastically profitable. She thought about the woman who had ironed Jessica Powell's dress a year ago, who had accepted Sweetheart and, of course, and You Wouldn't Understand as the soundtrack to her existence. That woman was gone, transformed as completely as if she'd never existed. Margaret Harrison, CEO of Harrison Fashion Group, founder of the Harrison Foundation, architect of her own liberation, picked up her phone and called David Williams. "Are you free for dinner tonight?" she asked. "Always," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Your place or mine?" "Mine. I want to cook for someone who sees me as more than decoration." "Margaret." "Yes, you're extraordinary." Margaret Harrison hung up the phone and gathered her things to go home to her penthouse, her independence, her carefully constructed life that belonged entirely to her. Tomorrow she would help Ruth Peterson begin her transformation. Next week she would announce the foundation's expansion to 3 new cities. Next month, she would celebrate Harrison Fashion Group's most profitable quarter in company history. But tonight, she would cook dinner for a man who valued her intelligence, make love to someone who treated her as an equal, and fall asleep in her own bed, in her own home, surrounded by the empire she'd built from the ashes of Richard Harrison's lies. The grandfather clock in her office chimed 8 times, its sound echoing through the building that now bore her name on every document, every contract, every decision that mattered. Margaret Harrison, who had spent 28 years being told she was too naive for the real world, walked out of her office knowing that she had not only survived the real world, she had conquered it. And somewhere in the city below, another woman was discovering that the iron had been in her hands all along.